hitting on a sleeper can be the make or break from you winning your fantasy football championship and you not making the playoffs. So today I'm bringing you 5 sleepers that you can find post round 7 in your redraft leagues that can help you win your league. First player that I think is a major sleeper right now is DeAndre Swift. And DeAndre Swift signs with the Chicago Bears this offseason. And a lot of people were super excited about DeAndre Swift last year. My man came out running through the first 6 weeks of the fantasy football season, when in week 2 he had 27 fantasy points, week 3 he had 14 fantasy points, 17.9 fantasy points in week 4, week 5 he had 16 fantasy points, 17 fantasy points in week 6, and then pretty much after that it started to slow down just a little bit. But he did have absolutely amazing upside for you, especially when you were drafting him last year in redraft in like the 8th or 9th round. Now this year, when we're looking at DeAndre Swift right now in underdog leagues, he's coming off the board as RB24, overall player 89 on underdog. So he's hitting in that potential sleeper category. And when we look at him last year, finished as the RB24 on a points per game basis with 12.5 fantasy points per game. Now, in the Chicago Bears offense, there's a lot of question marks. You got the rookie quarterback, you got 3 elite level wide receivers, and you got DeAndre Swift, you got Khalil Herbert, and you got Roschon Johnson to deal with in this backfield. Now, for me, they brought in DeAndre Swift to be the clear level bell cow. He does have that explosion, but when we're looking over at RotoViz on his range of outcomes, there is a pretty large range of outcomes where RotoViz has him averaging in PPR around 10.5 fantasy points per game. His mid fantasy points per game is around 10, his high is potentially 15, his low is like 6.9. So you do have to understand, he's playing with a quarterback. And if you tuned into my video yesterday, we talked about the success of rookie level quarterbacks. I know Caleb Williams is generational, but they're going to still have to rely on this running game to start off the season. And that's what makes me so excited about DeAndre Swift in your drafts, especially when you're able to, you don't have to draft him in your top 15. You don't have to draft him in your top 18. We've seen that elite level upside that when he does get the touches, like we were saying in those weeks when he was having massive games. I mean, we're talking about him having 28 carries, 16 carries, 14 carries, 17 carries, 10 carries, 15 carries. Like, guys, if he can get in the north of 15 carries, my man is absolutely electric. Now, if we pull up some projections for the Bears running back situation, we got DeAndre Swift, 206 rushing attempts, 865 yards, 5 total touchdowns, 4.2 yards per carry, 51 targets, 38 receptions, 2 receiving touchdowns. So when we're looking at him, honestly, the rushing touchdowns feels a little bit low with only 5, but 206 rushing attempts. Last season for the Eagles, he did have 229 rushing attempts. So right now, looking like this site is having him projected a little bit lower than what he did last year, but I don't know how that's going to be possible, because I think he's going to be given the ball somewhere between 225 to 230 times this year. They gave him the massive contract. They clearly wanted him. They got him in day 1 of free agency. I absolutely love DeAndre Swift as a sleeper, and I am targeting him everywhere. My second player that I think is a sleeper, but he really shouldn't be right now, is Kyler Murray. And you're going to be like, Caleb, what the heck, Kyler Murray? Like, I know Kyler Murray is elite. Well, right now he is being drafted in that sleeper category. I know a lot of people are starting to do that late round QB strategy, but when we're looking at Kyler Murray, he is QB7, but he's coming off the board in post round 7. He's coming off the board around pick 80, so like right in round 7. And I absolutely love this value for Kyler Murray, because last season we saw Kyler Murray in year 1 coming off the ACL average 18.9 fantasy points per game in the 8 games that he did play. Now, if we look back in 2022, Kyler Murray averaged 18.9 fantasy points per game and was the QB7 on a points per game basis. But all it takes is for him to get into that 22 to 23 points per game mark for him to be a top 5 QB in a points per game metrics. Now, we look at last year, yards per attempt 6.7, and he still, even in the 8 games, had 244 rushing yards. Like, he was still running the ball a ton. And when we're looking at quarterbacks that are going ahead of him, we got a guy like CJ Stroud, who I love the upside of CJ Stroud in the offense. He's absolutely electric, but he doesn't have the Konami code rushing upside that a guy like Kyler Murray does. And then you add in the fact that finally you have the Arizona Cardinals addressing the wide receiver position by bringing in Marvin Harrison Jr. with 4th overall pick in the draft. If we look at these in-game splits of Kyler Murray with an elite level, alpha level wide receiver of DeAndre Hopkins versus him without DeAndre Hopkins, we're going to see that when he did have DeAndre Hopkins, Kyler Murray averaged 25 fantasy points per game. And when he was out without DeAndre Hopkins in the 34 games that he's played in his career without DeAndre Hopkins, he only averaged 21 fantasy points per game. Now, I understand DeAndre Hopkins wasn't on the Arizona Cardinals last year, but what I'm trying to say is give Kyler Murray an elite level option, an elite target hog like a DeAndre Hopkins type, which I think Marvin Harrison Jr. can step into. And we're talking about Kyler Murray's points per game absolutely flourishing. Now, I know that's a lot of expectation to be putting on a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr. in this overall offense, but give me some Kyler Murray as a late round steal as a late round sleeper. Like I said, 7th round. Wait till the 7th round in your redraft leagues to go draft some Kyler Murray. Absolutely love the upside that he is providing. My next sleeper we're going to be talking about is Jakobi Meyers. And no one should be sleeping on Jakobi Meyers. I swear, Jakobi Meyers has turned into the new Brandon Cooks. Brandon Cooks was the type of guy that every year we were like, hey, he's a top 20 wide receiver. But then we'd like do our redraft rankings and we put him somewhere between wide receiver 25 to wide receiver 35, even though we darn well knew that he was going to finish as a top 20 wide receiver. Jakobi Meyers is going off the board as wide receiver 58 in underdog leagues, overall 120. And when we're looking at him last season, finished as a wide receiver 24 with 13.7 fantasy points per game in full PPR. And when we're talking about him, 71 receptions, 807 receiving yards, 11.4 yards per reception, 8 receiving touchdowns. My dude was absolutely electric. And I know the reason that people are starting to sleep on Jakobi Meyers is the same reason that people are starting to sleep on Devontae Adams. It's the fact that we're looking at this quarterback of either Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell, and we're saying to ourselves, I don't want any piece of that. But when we're talking about Jakobi Meyers, he had 106 targets last year and was able to do that with 13.7. I mean, I think the Raiders are going to be worse, and I think the target share, in my personal opinion, should be going absolutely flying up for Jakobi Meyers. If we are looking at Jakobi Meyers currently, his RotoViz projections, we're looking at him at 101 targets, 69 receptions, 759 receiving yards, and 4 total touchdowns, which if he does that, he will be behind what he did this last year with cut his touchdowns in half, which we do know touchdowns are kind of a fluky number. But I think the fact that they're projecting him to have less targets with a worse team, I don't really understand that projection for me when I'm looking at this overall Vegas team. I love some Jakobi Meyers. I think the value when you're talking about Jakobi Meyers in the same range as guys like A.D. Mitchell and Brandon Cooks, sign me up for some Jakobi Meyers. I will re-jump on the train. It's not like Jakobi Meyers has gotten super old. He got paid and he is 27 years old. He's entering into that prime of his career. Absolutely love the sleeper pick of a guy like Jakobi Meyers. My 4th sleeper that you should be drafting everywhere is Josh Downs. And I think a lot of people forgot about Josh Downs because of A.D. Mitchell. And they're going very similarly in these underdog drafts where A.D. Mitchell is going off the board as a wide receiver 57 and Josh Downs is going off the board as wide receiver 62. But the thing is, Josh Downs has done it. Josh Downs was that dude last season. When we're talking about wide receiver 51 on a points per game basis, it doesn't look great when we talk about it on our points per game basis, but he did have some absolutely explosive games. When we're talking about him, week 3 at 13 fantasy points, in week 5 at 15 fantasy points, 13 fantasy points in week 6, week 7 had 23 fantasy points, 14 fantasy points in week 8. Like, he had a little bit of a tear that he started to go on before he got a little bit nicked up and then kind of tried to play through an injury. Not having Anthony Richardson definitely hurt Josh Downs, but he did have really good chemistry with Gardner Minshew. So that's why I'm excited for him in this offense. Not only do you have A.D. Mitchell who can stretch the field more, you still have Michael Pittman Jr., you have Jonathan Taylor. I know a lot of people are worried about Josh Downs' overall target share because last year he only did have 98 targets in 17 games. But for me, I'm really not that scared. And when we look over here on RotoViz, they are projecting Josh Downs to have only 63 targets. So I know this is pretty conservative, understanding that the Colts are probably going to be a little bit better team, that they're going to be running the ball a ton. I don't know. Maybe I am wrong on Josh Downs, and maybe he's not an actual sleeper that we should be having, but I absolutely love Josh Downs. So I'm pumped to see what Josh Downs can do in a fully loaded offense with Shane Steichen year 2. I think Josh Downs is talented. I think Josh Downs is a more talented wide receiver than A.D. Mitchell. I know A.D. Mitchell got the 2nd round draft capital, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not an idiot, but I absolutely love some Josh Downs as a late round sleeper. And my final sleeper that you should be drafting in your underdog leagues, in your redraft leagues right now, is going to be Jerome Ford. Number 1, Nick Chubb. What the heck has happened? My man tore every part of his knee, and it's not sounding good. It hasn't sounded good for a long time, but I think the fact of the fantasy community is starting to really count on the fact that Jerome Ford probably is going to have a ton of more value this year than a guy like Nick Chubb. Now, Jerome Ford currently off the board is RB40 in these underdog drafts, overall pick 127. So you're having to take him ahead of guys like Zach Charbonnet, Kendrick Miller, behind guys like Austin Eckler and Ezekiel Elliott. Jerome Ford showed his explosion last year, RB25 on a points per game basis with 12.4. But when Nick Chubb went out and my man had to absolutely take over, we're talking about him pretty much kind of sliding right into that Kareem Hunt role all last season. When we talk like 11 fantasy points in week 6, 17 fantasy points in week 7, 12 fantasy points in week 9, 10 fantasy points in week 11. Like, I'm going to screenshot this and just, like, you can see these games. Dude's really solid. But when we come over here to RotoViz, when we look at the overall projections for him in this offense, you'll quickly see that Nick Chubb is projected to have 232 rushing attempts and Jerome Ford's only expected to have 165. Now, that's just basing it off the fact that we assume that Nick Chubb is going to be able to come back week 6, week 7, and just demand the volume that he is. But let's not forget that this offense with Kevin Stefanski has really proven that they love to have two bell cows involved. We've seen the Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb, both those guys being RB1s in fantasy football. I don't think there's any reason to believe that Jerome Ford and Nick Chubb can't both be mutually beneficial to each other in this offense. In the 2 games that Nick Chubb and Jerome Ford played together last year, Jerome Ford actually averaged 13.85 fantasy per game. Now, in the outsplit of the 15 games that he played without Nick Chubb, he averaged 12.37. So I think the fact of the matter is if people are going to be saying Jerome Ford cannot coexist with Nick Chubb, I think that's going to be really, really unfair. And I actually think Nick Chubb coming back and maybe not even being 100% healthy, that's going to be a big benefit to Jerome Ford because he's not going to have to take all the carries. Because Jerome Ford, as efficient as he is, he's not the biggest running back at 5'11", 210. He is that prototypical size that we like. Doesn't have the build, I think, to just take a full year of wear and tear on his body. But I absolutely love Jerome Ford's current value. I think the upside is the moon. So absolutely love these sleepers. Let me know what you think of these sleepers down below. Hit that like and subscribe button if you like redraft fantasy football. I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.